All right, so yeah, let's just get started then. I think most of the people have joined by now. Yeah, so everybody, welcome to our React.js tutorial. In this tutorial, I will be teaching you guys pretty much everything you need to know about the basics of React.js in order for you guys to be able to start building dynamic web apps, which is what we're all here for. I will like to mention before we start that this is a more, conceptual tutorial. So I'll be going over like higher level concepts, some of which may be like slightly unrelated. So I'll be bouncing between a bunch of different things. Some may not even be completely React related, but more just like Node project related. So don't get like too caught up on any one concept. We're not going to be diving too deep into any code or anything like that. But the next React tutorial led by Jade, our other education director, will be more of a code along, more code heavy. So yeah, just keep that in mind that this is just more conceptual, just trying to get out the React concepts, like just trying to get you guys familiar with them, because it is really a lot to learn in React and you can't just teach it all right away and it won't all stick in your head right away. So the goal is just to give you guys like a high level view of what React's all about. Yeah, so yeah, before I get into some like code and some React topics, first I just want to talk about a little bit about like what is React. And so I have three little facts for you guys. The first of which is that React is a free and open source front-end JS library for building user interfaces. The second fact is that it's maintained by Facebook and a large community of individual developers and companies. So what this means is that going forward, React will have, it'll grow quite a bit since it's backed by so many developers and companies. Like a large portion of the market for front-end developers uses React. So it definitely will be a good skill to have in the future. And a third fact I have is that React is typically used as the like base of the single page front-end application or mobile application if you want to use React Native. And yeah, I think that's a good thing to bring up, that some of you guys may want to move into like mobile dev or something later on, once you get more experience with development. And if you choose to do so, then React Native is like very similar to React in many ways. So it is quite transferable and you won't have a hard time switching over to that. So yeah, that kind of ties into like why even use React. Well, like I mentioned, it's very community driven, and it has a good long-term outlook. But two other reasons why you would use React, especially maybe over another front-end framework, like maybe you've heard of Angular or Vue, something like that, is that it is quite intuitive. I find it quite intuitive. And also the fact that React provides us in a sort of interface to build reusable UI components. And that allows for pretty fast iteration and iterative development. And so that's a bit about like what is React. Some popular web pages, if you're wondering, that are built in React are like everything from like Netflix to Dropbox to Airbnb, Reddit. Ignore this picture of YouTube. It's actually not built in React. But yeah, like a lot of things are built in React that you will see. And after this, if you haven't already, you guys should install React DevTools. And if you look at the top right of this web page on the left side of my screen, you can actually see that I have the React DevTools, which basically tells you whenever a web page is. And so I often find myself like clicking on random web pages and you'll say, oh, this is built in React. And that just goes to show that like how much of the internet these days like uses React. And yeah, so moving on to like how React works. So I went over this in the last tutorial, which was the JavaScript tutorial. I went over the DOM a bit. And essentially, if you guys missed out on that, the DOM is basically just a tree-like structure that represents the HTML nodes that comprise your web page. So like everything from the HTML tag, and then you have like that branches off into like the head and the body tag. And then the body may have like a paragraph tag, right? So it's just a big tree structure that represents the HTML elements. The virtual DOM is essentially just allows it so that when we add new UI components to a web page, we can sort of hold this a virtual structure representing the UI in memory, and we can sync it with the real DOM. And so this is like the key feature of React. And in this slideshow that will be available to you guys afterwards, I have linked a little thing about the virtual DOM if you guys want to learn more about it. But yeah, don't worry too much about like this graph, this picture if you don't understand it. Basically just understand that the virtual DOM is just there to allow us to sync with the real DOM when we add new UI elements to the page. But yeah, that's just something I wanted to mention first, just because that's sort of a key part about React. But but you won't really need to be like paying attention to that or doing anything manual with the DOM, since once again, like React will do that stuff for you. You won't need to manually manipulate the DOM or anything like that. And so just moving forward a bit, we have JSX. And now if you would shift your attention to the right side of my screen, you can see I have a VS Code editor open here and I have a React project. This React project I actually have on my IDE is the web page that you can see on the left. So I basically have the tutorial like web page built in React. And so I want to highlight a bit about JSX. And so JSX stands for JavaScript XML. And the code you see on the right here, like you see a bunch of HTML code here. This is actually not HTML, but rather it is JSX. And so JSX and HTML are very, very similar, but there are very minor differences that allow us to use it in a JavaScript file. And so you're probably wondering like, oh, how am I using like this HTML like code in a JS file along with a bunch of JS code? Well, yeah, that's the whole point. Like in React, you have a lot of your logic inside your component that is in JavaScript. And then you actually have this return syntax where you can actually return a chunk of UI like written in this JSX that will eventually go into the DOM, like I mentioned. And so, yeah, the differences between JSX and HTML are pretty subtle. One big example, and you can see there's 2 lines of code I have here on the left side of my screen. I think that's yellow or green highlighted here. The one difference you can see is that when you apply like attributes to a tag, like this H1 tag here, or we're applying a class actually, we use class name instead of class. So that's one difference. That's probably one of the biggest differences. And the second thing is that if we want to use inline CSS styling, instead of saying like style equals and then using like straight up CSS, we have to use these double curly braces. And then you have to use this like camel case to describe the type of CSS attribute. And then you have to use like single quotes around the units. So yeah, those are the differences, but you'll pick that up quite quickly because it's really minor difference. But yeah, so that's essentially how we like create, how we write actual HTML UI inside of a React component. And so that brings me to like actual React components. I think before I explain components, I just want to take a big step back and just sort of explain like a bit about React projects, like React and Node and everything like that. And so I'm not sure if you guys have done this already. I know some of you guys probably have already familiarized yourself with like Create React app and like how to create a React project. But just to give you guys a refresher, like when you're using, oh, sorry, there's a few things in the chat. Okay, yeah, that was from a few minutes ago. Yeah, sorry. So if you've used Create React app before, you just write it in your terminal. A lot of you guys probably use VS Code too, so you're probably familiar. Like you just do like create React app. I guess you have like npx here as well, something like that. And so basically, when you do create React app, this basically gives you the whole folder structure that looks a little something like what you see on the left side of my editor, my text editor. And so what this looks like is a public folder and a source folder and a node modules folder. And so in the public folder, we just have like some basic things like this favicon. I think that's for the this little icon that shows in the browser tab. Pretty sure that's what that's for. And yeah, the public folder, you won't really be doing a whole lot with. There's also the index file where you can like import fonts and stuff like that. But you won't ever really be writing any of your components or any code in here. So don't worry too much about the public folder. the main important thing is the source folder. In the source folder, you will be provided with like an app.js file. This is essentially, you can visualize like the root entry point of our React app. Similar, like you can visualize it in terms of the DOM. Like you would have an app.js file, and then once you start putting UI components inside of this file, you can visualize it as if app is the parent, and then within app you have like various different screens that branch off. Like maybe you have like a home screen, a dashboard screen, like maybe like you have like whatever, you have a bunch of children component that branch off of this app component, right? You also get this test file. You can like delete this. This is just for running like front end tests. I don't think we're going to be focusing on that at all anytime soon, so don't worry about that. And then you have the index file, which once again, this is actually, I guess this is actually the real root file, because this is where we actually use app. Like if you see, we use app right here, and then all the code we write will actually be within app. So yeah, technically index is the main like root. And then we have app, which is like the secondary root, let's just say. But yeah, so that is essentially the, oh, sorry, but there's one other thing which is quite important, which is the package.json file. And essentially, this is just a file that will sort of tell us some like info about a React project. So say I want to like install some like icon library or something to use some specific icons. Then once I would install that through Node, I would see that come up as a dependency here in this package.json file. And I think, I guess now is a good time to give you guys a quick example of that. Like, just so you know, when you're doing your React projects, like you're not going to be writing literally everything from scratch. Like there's a bunch of different component libraries out there. And I'll give you a quick example of one right now, which is Material UI. And essentially you can take like any of these UI components, like you have, this table, like you can import this table into your React app. You can use these chips, right? You can use tooltips. So like when you hover over an icon, you have this little piece of text that shoots out at the bottom or wherever you want it to, right? And so just so you know, like just be aware that you're not going to be writing like everything from scratch. There's going to be a lot of like installing new packages, like importing a lot of stuff, a lot of external stuff that you find online to essentially help you guys out with building your UI. Since if you did everything from scratch, it would take like a really long time, more often than not. And yeah, so that sort of sums up the like project structure. One thing I would like to mention before I dive into like components and like specific React syntax is just the node terminal. And sorry, you're like, a lot of you guys probably use Mac. And so you've probably already like seen like this bash shell that I have in my terminal here. I'm using Z shell. Essentially, when you're running a node project, there's a few different commands. Like, let me just show you guys right now. So if I refresh this page, it's dead because I just killed the process. But now say I want to start my React project up, I would use a node command, which is npm and followed by start. And once again, I'm pretty sure in the package.json file, we have this as a script. We have the start command as React script start. And yeah, so basically you just run npm start and it will start up your web page in this local server here. And if I want to do something, like say I want to change a piece of UI code in my React project, all I would have to do is save. And if you see right now, I'm going to save. You can see that in the bottom right corner, when I save, it's going to say compiling, and it'll like recompile the site for me to really reflect those changes in the UI. So right now I just saved. And if you can see in the bottom right corner, once I save, it just says compiling, right? And so that'll reflect the changes in our UI. And yeah, okay, so I think that covers a lot of the like logistical like parts about React projects, and just sort of getting you guys familiarized with how React is, like how all these things are interconnected, like Node, React. And yeah, so you're just moving on from that, I have components and props. So these are two really like big concepts. I mean, props is more of a concept. Components is more of like a fundamental, like a really core fundamental of React. And so basically, I guess a good way to start explaining this is just, I want you guys to look at this app.js file that I'm in right now. Like I mentioned, this is the root, like root DOM node you can imagine of our project. Like this is our root, this is pretty much our root element of our project. This is basically a component. And so you can see these .js files are components. This syntax is probably really weird to you guys. If you're wondering like what some of this is, I will explain it right now. So there's a few different things going on in most React component files. The first thing you can see is these imports. And so when you have a React component, more often than not, you will probably be using some sort of external CSS style sheet. So that'll essentially just be a CSS style sheet like in any other stack, regardless of React or not, to style a bunch of HTML, right? And so you'll usually have some CSS getting imported into your React component. You'll also typically import other components because as you start doing more and more React, you'll realize that components will typically include like children components. Like you'll have one component that will require, some other UI component to be embedded inside of it. And in order to do that, you would need to import it if you want to use it within that component. And so I'm going to get to this like tile thing later. If you see this import tile from component/tile.js, I'll get to that later, but just know that this is me importing a component into this component. And then the third thing I have here is import useState from React. This is me importing a hook, and you'll find yourself often importing like hooks, importing like other functions from other JS files. But yeah, the bottom line is there will be a lot of imports. I think now is a good time to explain exports. So I'll just move over to this tile.js file. So once again, this is a JS file, but it's also a component. It's a sort of packaged up component that we can reuse wherever we want. And so I just want to take the time to just show you guys like how we export things. So if you see on this app.js file, we actually import tile from, and then we give it the path. And so if you want to import something, it needs to actually be exported from the place that you are importing it from. And so if you look at this, we have export default and followed by the component definition. And that's pretty much it. Like there is some like different ways in a JavaScript to do imports and exports. There's like the whole concept of like ES6 modules versus not. So you can do some more research on that on your own, but don't really worry too much about that. This is more of just something that you need to get syntactically correct in order for your like imports and exports to work properly. But yeah, so that is that. One thing I will explain before getting into the specific like React component definitions is like file navigation. Like you might be wondering, how do I like import a file from wherever in my project? And so I'll give you this example. Say I'm currently working in the app.js file, which I am. And now say I want to, let's say I'm working in this tile.js file. And I'll say I want to import some image from the public folder inside the image folder. So what I would actually have to do for that is I would actually have to have, okay, let's just use this import statement here just so I can show you guys as an example. So inside of this path, essentially how it works is that we would use .. to go backwards outside of our directory, and we would use .. to stay inside of our directory. And so I'm currently working in this components folder, which is inside the source folder. And so if I wanted to use something in this image folder, which is in our public folder, I would have to first navigate backwards outside of our component folder, and then I would have to navigate forwards into this image folder. Well, first into the public folder, then into the image folder. And so if you guys have used like Linux before, or any sort of like Unix-like system, you're probably familiar with like navigating file systems. And so it's pretty much like the same thing, like .. or like cd .. Like basically .. is to go back. Single dot is just to stay in your current directory. But yeah, pretty much just get used to file paths because you will need to do a lot of importing and exporting when you have a React project, because at the end of the day, React is all about like bringing different pieces of UI together to create a web page. And so yeah, I think that is a good explanation of like the folder structure, like file system, or sorry, like file paths and everything like that. And so now I sort of just want to explain like how do you define a component and like what is all of this syntax here. So don't I like to mention this one more time, like don't worry about any of this code. This is just the code that is like the website on the left is comprised of. Like this is just the code that the tutorial is built in. I will have this in the GitHub in case any of you guys want to like go over it and review this afterwards. But yeah, don't worry about any of this code for now. Just worry about the specific code that I will focus on. And so the first thing I want to get started with is just defining a component. And so there are pretty much two ways to define a component in React. And I think I have this in my tutorial slides. Oh no, I don't. But basically, like a few years back, what they would used to do is define components as classes. So you would have something like class followed by the component name, and then you would basically just write the component in a class. But you know, in recent times, React has made a like paradigm shift towards functional components. And so if you can see right here, this app component is defined as a function. So we use the keyword function followed by the name of the component, and then we can take props as well. We don't need props, but I'll get to that later. But essentially, yeah, we just use the function keyword and the name of the component. And then we have these open, close curly braces, the closed curly braces here. And then if we want to use this component somewhere else, and I already showed you guys that index.js uses app.js, and that's why we need to export default app. And so, yeah, if we want to use this component somewhere else, we need to export it. And so you'll find yourself often exporting the app, the component. And just so you guys know, if you guys use VS Code, there are a lot of helpful extensions. Like personally, I use this extension that lets me type in, okay, I don't have it on my current Mac. I had it on my old computer, but basically I had this little shorthand where I would type in RAFCE and it would generate like a boilerplate, like it would generate all of like the skeleton code for a React component. And I think I'm gonna actually add that in the resources tab later right after this tutorial, because that is pretty helpful. Like when you're creating a React component, you don't wanna like have to go manually write out like, oh, function this, like write all the curly braces and everything. So yeah, I will add that after. And yeah, so that is how do you define a component. There are also other ways, like if you were in my JavaScript tutorial a few days back, you might be familiar with arrow functions. When I do React, I usually use arrow functions. So you can also use arrow functions to define a React component, but it really doesn't matter. I just thought I'd mention that there are multiple ways to do it. And the second main sort of thing with defining components is that when you have a functional component, you first define the function, and then you have a sort of like chunk of logic, like a chunk of JavaScript that sort of is there to sort of serve the UI. And so after that chunk of JavaScript, you have the actual JSX, which I described as basically like the actual HTML UI stuff. And so inside, basically to return all of this this UI stuff, we need to put it inside of this return statement. And so typically what this looks like is the return keyword followed by open and close parentheses, the close parentheses all the way down here. And inside these open and close parentheses, we have a whole bunch of like JSX code. And so when we return this, basically wherever we use this component, all of this JSX will be inserted into the DOM at that location. And so yeah, that is like the basics of React components. Just taking it like one step further now, to actually like give you an idea of like what is a component, like why is it useful, what is an example of one. I thought this was a good idea, a good example. If you just focus your attention on the left side of my screen, I have Google Drive open. And so this is my Google Drive. Currently I'm on the starred page, but I want you guys to think, just as an exercise to understand components, I want you guys to imagine like, what if this Google Drive page had like 10 other different pages that we wanted to navigate to? And also like imagine that all of these pages, we still want to have this nav bar. Like you see, we have this nav bar at the top where we have the search bar. We have this little, icon to go back to the home page. We have this little icon to click on our profile. Maybe we can log out. We can manage our Google account, stuff like that. Say we want like any given page we navigate to still have this nav bar. Now, this is a good example of where components come into play. And I guess, yeah, I guess Google Drive isn't built in React, but the concept still like stands. Essentially, if we had a bunch of different pages, you can visualize that as if we had a bunch of different components for each screen. So for the start page, we could have like a starred screen component. For the recent page that you see on the left tab, on the left here, we could have like a recent screen.js component. And now imagine that each of these components, at somewhere towards the top, we can actually import the navbar component and use that navbar component within these individual screen components. And so like, I think that's a good way of showing you guys how you can have multiple different screens that might require the same UI component or some similarities in the UI. Another example, which isn't on this page, but is on a lot of different web pages, is a footer. And oftentimes you will see like that the footer is available on like most screens you can navigate to, but the actual screen itself is totally different. Like it serves a totally different purpose, right? And yeah, so that's basically like what components, how do you define components, like what they are, what they're useful for. Now I have a little like practical example for you guys. If you look at the left side of my screen on the web page, you can see we have 4 little like tiles or cards, whatever you want to call it. Each one has a different animal on it. So this one has a monkey, this one has a duck, this one giraffe, this one dog. Essentially, each one of these components visually is comprised of a picture for one, a title for 2, which is the name of the animal, and a description, which you can see is like this little caption. Like you see, this is a duck. Like that's like our little description of this tile. And so each of these are, you know, as you can probably guess, reusable components. I haven't hard coded like any of these images or like pieces of text into the component. I've just made it generic so that I can use this component wherever we want. And basically, the way I've done this, and if you focus your attention on my IDE, and once again, don't try to like focus too much on all like this random code. I just want you guys to look at this code that I've highlighted here. And so I think at this point, you guys should be familiar with like HTML, CSS. So you should be familiar with like what is a div. Like a div is just like, it's just like a container that holds UI elements. It's just a generic container when you can't find anything more semantic. And in this case, we've given it an inline style. We basically have done this so we can display each of these tiles in Flex, and Flex typically goes by default in the row direction. So basically, I've just done this so we can have the tiles like side by side, like 1, 2, 3, 4. So yeah, don't worry about too much about that, like HTML, CSS stuff. The main point I'm trying to drive home is these tiles. So if you remember above, I actually imported this tile from component/tile.js. And that was this file that I'm on right now. And so what I've done is to actually use these components, you just use the name of that component in an HTML tag. So it's just like normal HTML. And you will notice pretty often, if you use VS Code at least, that the name of like custom built components will be in a different color. Like I think this is in green and the div is like in blue, right? So you will often see like the color difference, and also components will always start with uppercase letters. So that's how you know it's a custom built component. And so basically what I've done here is I've just used this component 4 times over. The key that I'm trying to drive home here is about props. And so props is a very important concept in React. You can essentially think of it as a way of passing or allowing data to flow throughout your application. And so in this case, I have this app.js component and I have 4 different tiles. And the whole objective here is to pass like specific values into this tile component to style the component. And so like, for example, here we have in this monkey component, we have a picture of a monkey, we have this word that says monkey, and then we have the description. And so the way I've actually done this is I've actually passed a path to a monkey image, which is in this images folder on my left. It's somewhere here, like in this monkey image right here. So this is the monkey image. And essentially I've passed that image as a prop to this component. And I've done the same thing with the title and with the text. I just passed this string I basically say title equals, and then I give it a string. Text equals, and I give it a string, right? And so this is a way of dynamically injecting like context into this component. And so if you're wondering how this works, like basically you can think of it like HTML attributes, which is basically what it is. Like if you see what we're doing, we basically have an HTML like tag where we are giving like HTML like attributes. So we're giving like an image, we're giving a title, we're giving a piece of text. And the way this works is that when you're actually defining the component that you want to be used dynamically, what you do is you first take this keyword props. So a few minutes ago, I described that you define functions with the function keyword followed by the name of the component. And there's this keyword called props, which is a props object that each function, each component has. And it basically gives you an interface where you can take in a variety of different props that you want to be used at use time, you could say. Like whenever you want to use this component, you can then decide what you want to show in the component. And so what I've done is I've taken the keyword props and I've said that, okay, hey, we have this component called title. And basically what it is that it's a div first and foremost. And inside of the div, it's going to be an image followed by a h2 tag, followed by a paragraph tag. And inside of the inside of the image tag, like what we want the image to be is whatever we have as props. So basically whatever we have set as props.image is whatever is going to be set as the actual image. And same thing with h2, like whatever props.title equals is whatever is going to be set inside of this h2 tag. And so that's opposed to writing like monkey directly. Like you might just write monkey directly. And if I were to do that, then we wouldn't be able to use this component for duck, draft, dog. It would always just say monkey. And so, yeah, that's basically the whole point of props. And so, yeah, so you define the props in the component, and then you give the real values when you actually use the component. And yeah, so that is props. And yeah, so just moving forward. So yeah, components, props, those are two big concepts. There are two large concepts as well that I would like to touch on in this tutorial, which is state and lifecycle. And so so now I want you guys to turn your attention to this block of code that I've highlighted here. And so I'm going to sort of carefully walk through this. And also I'm going to open up React DevTools to sort of give a proper breakdown of how this works. And just so you guys know, after this tutorial, I highly recommend downloading React DevTools. You can search it up. It's basically, I mentioned it early in this tutorial, like this thing I have in my top right, that it tells you like when a page is built in React or not. I highly recommend downloading React DevTools because it allows you to see basically a tree-like structure of your web application with regards to React components. And so you can have this in addition to your normal DOM visualization, like your normal DOM tree. But the React components is very useful because you will be able to see props and state. And I'm about to describe state. Actually, I think before I describe state, I think now is a good time to go over any questions. So I'll give like 1-2 minutes, just if you guys want to put anything in the chat, just because I went over a lot of stuff. Yeah, so Cal, you asked, is React DevTools a Chrome extension? Let me search that up right now. Yeah, React DevTools is an extension. A lot of you guys probably use Chrome, so you can just search up like React DevTools, and it is a Chrome extension. And as you saw, like once again, to access it, you just right-click, inspect element. You guys are probably used to this already because now after the JS and CSS HTML tutorials, you probably know about like the console, the elements tab to see like the DOM. But then there's also, once you install the React DevTools, you'll have this little components tab. And once again, this is very useful because you can actually see, right here, you can see these individual tile components, and you can even see the props. If you look on the right, you can see these props here. So it's very useful for like debugging and really seeing the like meat and potatoes of your React app. So yeah, I'll just give 1 more minute for any questions. Yeah, so okay, so you're saying what, Cal, you said what does React DevTools do besides tell you if a website uses React or not? Well, like I just mentioned, you can actually go into this little tree-like view of the different React components that your app is built out of. So on the left, like you can see, I have the whole tutorial built in React, and I've actually used these four little tile components. And if you actually want to see where these tile components are, like React DevTools literally shows you that, hey, we have an app component, and inside of the app component, we have four tile components. And so I'll give you an even more deep like explanation. Like say inside of this dog card, we wanted to have like some button in the bottom right corner. Like let's say here where I'm hovering my cursor, like say we wanted some sort of like open button, something like that, that does something when you click it. We could even like implant that as a component inside of our tile component. And then that would reflect in our dev tools. Like our dev tools would say, hey, you have this tile component and it has a child component, and it would let us click on it and basically see like a drop down of the children. And so basically the dev tools just lets you see one, like the like parent sibling, like parent child, sibling to sibling relationships, in addition to like props, state, hooks, everything like that. Yeah, so that's basically it. Okay, yeah, so moving forward to state and life cycle. So basically, if you guys were listening before, I mentioned the fact that React used to have class-based components, but now we've sort of moved to functional components. And so ever since the inception of functional components, there is a big focus on something called hooks. And essentially what hooks are, like hooks were a new addition once again in early 2019 to React with functional components. And basically what they let you do is use state and other React features without writing classes. And a good explanation of state, I think the best way I can explain state to you guys is that state is like the context that is tied to a given component. Like for example, this tile component, we have four tile components here, which are this component on the right on my IDE. And now there's a few different pieces of context that pertain to this component. The first of which is like the name of the animal. The second of which is like the, description of the animal, right? And so these are two pieces of data that pertain to the component. And so in this specific instance, I've actually passed the data through props. And that's just one way of having like data flow throughout your components. But what I also could have done is use this syntax where basically I define a state variable and a function to change or set that state variable. And so the best way to describe this is to just sort of throw you guys into this. Basically, this line of code, what this does is it uses this hook called useState. And what useState does for us is it provides us a variable. It's just a simple variable, in this case called color, and it provides us a function to set that variable, whatever that may be. And we can call it whatever we want. We don't need to call it set color. I'm pretty sure we can just call it whatever we want. But yeah, basically, and if I didn't describe this before, we actually import useState. You have to import hooks to be able to use them. But yeah, basically we use this useState hook and we'll take a default value. So I've given it blue. Basically, when we render the page, it'll by default use the argument that we pass into the useState hook. And so yeah, basically useState just gives us a variable and a function to set that variable. And so I think I'm just going to move away from this this tile of this example into this like stateful element example. Basically, just basically how this works is that we have this color variable, which is a piece of state, and now we have this function called handle click. And basically this button you see here on the left, this blue button, this is just a UI element somewhere lost in the sea of code here. Don't really worry about that. Basically, all I've done is I've attached an event listener to the button so that whenever the click event happens, we call this function called handle click. And actually here, I bet I could find it somewhere here. Yeah, exactly. So where we have this button element, we have onClick, and then inside onClick, we actually give the name of the function that we want to be called when onClick happens. And so this is a bit different than what I showed you guys in the JS tutorial. That was like add like element.add event listener, and then you would add like the event type in like single quotes, and then you would add like a second argument, which would be the function. In React, it's different. Like you guys are gonna have to get used to this like JSX stuff, where you have like the event equals, and then in curly braces the function. But basically we have this button, which is this button you can see here on the left. And when I click it, I'm going to use this function called handle click. And what the handle click button does, or function does, is it basically says like, hey, if our color state variable is blue, make it red. Otherwise, meaning it's red, make it blue. So basically what we're doing is we're just toggling between the two colors. And so if I click on this button here, you can see that the text becomes red. And so basically what I'm trying to drive home to you guys is that this color, the color in this instance is a piece of context that is tied to our app component. Like the app component at all times keeps track of whether color is set to red or blue. And to take this one step further, if I click on the app component in DevTools, and this will show you guys the power of DevTools. If I click on this app component, you guys can actually see under the hooks tab, we see each piece of state that we have. And in this instance, we have state, and we have, in quotes, we have red. And now here's like the cool part. Like when I click on the button again, pay attention to the DevTools. If you pay attention to the DevTools, you can see that it is switching between red and blue every time I click this. And so that is basically all state is. It's just variables, pieces of data that are tied to a given component. And I think now you guys are probably, if there's one thing you guys are confused about, it's probably like the question of, whoa, why do you use state when you could just use a normal variable? Like, why can't we just say like const color equals blue, and then have this function where we mutate the value of color? And so the reason behind that is that when we re-render the web page, we want those changes to be reflected in the UI. So when I click on something like this button, for example, we want that variable to change values, and we want that to be reflected in the DOM. And so this isn't possible with normal variables. And I think, yeah, and I actually searched this up here. So if you guys want, like, you can read, like, Stack Overflow has a lot of stuff for React, but basically like this page just said like that use state and state variables will re-render in the view. And so that's why we use state in React. And basically, if I didn't already mention this, like every component in React has a state object. I'm pretty sure like you can even say like state equals, and then just like set like a state array or something like that, or state object. That might just be in class-based components, but typically in functional components, which I'm pretty sure is what you guys will be working with in the future. You'll see this a lot, like this syntax where you say const, and then you have this little array of two array where you have the state variable and the state setting function variable equals to use state. And yeah, so you're going to see this syntax a lot when you work with functional React. And yeah, so yeah, I described like hooks. Like a hook is just a special function that lets you hook into React features and allow in real time. Let's see if there's anything else here. Yeah, I think that's everything. I'll just yeah, so I think now is a good time to just like wrap up the tutorial and get into the mini project. So yeah, I think last tutorial, like our mini project was like for you guys to like sort of rebuild the calculator app I showed you guys. This tutorial, it's going to be sort of a light mini project, since I don't want to overwhelm you guys too much, especially since Jade will be giving you guys a more advanced React tutorial anyway, where there will be like some sort of real like interactive project to sort of complete. But for you guys after this tutorial, if you haven't already done this, I highly recommend you guys as an exercise, go and create a React project with Create React App. I recommend if you're not familiar with React App, Create React App. It's just a tool like created by Facebook that basically gives you this whole folder structure. So I highly recommend you guys go make your own React project. And I have this sort of exercise I want you guys to go over. It is right here. So basically, if you see on the right side of my screen, I have this little like image. Basically, this is very similar to the whole like color, red and blue color toggling thing. Basically, the only difference is that like in this example, it's like a counter. So basically, I'm just going to quickly walk through this example before I let you guys go and maybe try it on your own. So basically, in this example, if you paid attention, you can see that this is just a React component called example, and we've defined it using the function keyword. And all this component really is just us defining a state variable called count, and then a set count function, which is the function that takes an argument to set that count variable. And we're using a default value of 0. And basically all we're doing is we're returning a div with a paragraph and a button. And the paragraph will tell us how many times we've clicked the button. And the button will basically have a function that calls our set count button and basically mutates that piece of state. And basically what I mean by that is when we click the button, we're actually going to call our state setting function called set count. And we're going to say, hey, every time we click this button, we want to set count to whatever count is plus 1. So basically just like count plus equals 1, count equals count plus 1. Basically, we're just incrementing count whenever we click the button. And we do this through this event listener. Like whenever on click happens, we call this set count function. And then the paragraph, inside of the paragraph, we dynamically access this JavaScript variable. And I think this is one last piece of like theory I will tell you guys is that like if you want to access JavaScript variables dynamically within JSX, you have to use curly braces. So if you see here, we had defined a component and then we define a JavaScript variable, which is literally just a piece of state, like I mentioned. But then to actually use that count variable inside of our UI, we have to use curly braces to basically dynamically inject that value inside of our p tag as a child of our p tag. And so, yeah, this is basically what I want you guys to do. I want you guys to create a new React project and create a component where you have a button and a paragraph or any UI component for that matter. You can get creative and just figure out how the use state hook works and how like what state is and why it's important. And I think this also is a good example for like showing you guys, like getting you guys used to JSX, especially with this like curly brace syntax, like this on click stuff. But yeah, I think that pretty much sums up the tutorial, sums up a lot of the fundamental concepts and theory about React. And yeah, Jade will be giving you a more advanced tutorial in the coming days, so stay tuned for that. Now, I guess I'll just leave like 2 minutes right now just for questions before we leave it off. Yeah, okay, good question. Will we put this function in the app.js? So what I mentioned earlier was that typically, like the whole point of app.js, typically when you're actually building a React app, you're gonna find yourself using something called like routes. And typically like the app file is where you like describe like which route points to like which component. That probably doesn't make any sense. So like if it doesn't make any sense, don't worry about that. But like you can also just put any UI you want in the app.js file. So yeah, so that being said, for the sake of this exercise, just go ahead and do this in the app.js file because like whatever, since like I mentioned, the app is just the root, app.js is just a root component. It's totally fine if you put any different UI components you want inside of app.js. So yeah, feel free to go like return whatever UI containing this exercise inside of app.js. But just be aware that like going forward, you don't usually put a whole lot of like UI stuff inside your app, you will find yourself more often than not like putting separate components in your app file to make it a little bit messy, less messy. But yeah, for now, just go and add it in your app.js file. Exactly. Yeah. The whole point, the whole like idea behind React is to have like modular, reusable components. And once again, like I want you guys to get used to thinking in terms of like this tree. Like we have this tree-like structure, starting with app that will branch out into a bunch of different components. Maybe it'll branch out into like screen components. Like different screens will have like their own set of components, and so on and so forth. So yeah, you're exactly right about that. That we want React to be as modular as possible. We don't want to have like a shit ton of like UI code like all hammered into like one like monolithic component. So yeah, we want it to be modular. For the sake of you're okay, so Cal, you said for the sake of this exercise, should I put it below, above, or within the function app? Um, well, okay, well, first of all, you have to put it within the function app because you can't use like things like state outside of the actual component because once again, like this is just a JS file at the end of the day, and it won't really like these are React features like things like use state. So you need to have it within the function, but outside of the return statement. So remember, like the return statement is for the UI part that you want to be returned into the DOM, and above the return part is our actual like logic stuff, which is where you should be doing like setting state variables and doing things like that. Outside of the function, like typically, like outside of the component entirely, typically you will see like some logic related stuff, but it won't be like React logic. So yeah, definitely do this example, like do all of this like state setting stuff inside of the function definition, but before the return statement. Okay, so Cal, you asked, import is the only line outside of app. I mean, let's see. I mean, yeah, in my example that I showed you guys, yeah, import is the only example. Um, but like I mentioned, like sometimes you will do perform some sort of logic outside of the app. I don't exactly like know what's the difference. Like it doesn't really matter though, as long as you make sure you use React features inside of React components. But you should be able to like pick that up pretty easily through trial and error. Like you're gonna get errors if you don't, if you try to use like use state outside of the function. So yeah, like once again, in this example, the only things outside of the actual function are just import statements because this is a pretty simple like a pretty simple component I have here. Okay, yeah, so I guess there's no more questions. So yeah, I guess it's nearing 7. So yeah, thanks guys for coming out. I hope you guys learned something from this. It's fine if you like didn't. It takes a while to like get used to these React concepts. Um, but yeah, I'm gonna make these resources available for you guys afterwards. I highly recommend just reading up as much as you can and just like experimenting with these little mini projects and just trying to get like a UI rendered out onto the screen and basically just start building up your knowledge from like props, components, hooks, and everything like that. So don't worry if you didn't learn too much right now. There's another React tutorial coming. And yeah, I mean, it's a long process, but just take your time with it. And yeah, yeah, thanks everybody for coming out. I think we will end it here.